Hello, my name is Arthur Woodworth, and today I will be teaching you how to solder. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that the soldering iron is unplugged. This is very important because when the soldering iron is heated up, it is hot enough to give you third-degree burns, the worst kind. You will want to make sure that you have a stand for your soldering iron, because the soldering iron should never touch a table. And then you'll plug it in. And when you plug it in, you'll need to wait 5 to 10 minutes, in most cases, for it to be properly heated up. So what we have here is a printed circuit board, and well, it's called that because it's a circuit board that has the circuit printed onto it. So we can see on this side all the components are labeled. So this is a resistor, this is a diode, this is a switch, or a button really in this case, and various other symbols. So then they match up to the labeling on the various components. So like the diode is it has a direction to it, so you want to make sure you follow that. Same thing with this integrated circuit. It's indicated the same way as on the board. So then on the other side we have these copper pads. Now the important thing about these copper pads is that they are what actually allow the circuit to work. So you'll put your components in from this side so you can line them up properly, and then you'll flip over to this side and bend the legs out a bit so that it stays in by itself, and you don't have to like hold it in there because that's a bad idea. Then you'll be soldering a component to the copper pads. Now, you want to be careful with this. So, we have these two. This is a good example of soldering. You only want just enough solder to make a nice uniform cone-like shape around the pad. So you can see this capacitor is soldered in very nicely. But on the other hand, we have this circuit board, which is just a mess. I have no idea who did this, but it's terrible. So way too much solder was used here. Way too much solder was used here. This button is not only on the wrong side of the board, it's also melted partially. So your circuit board ends up looking like this. You've done it wrong, and you've wasted a complete circuit board. So never do this. It's always best to err on the side of not using enough solder, because then you can just simply add more solder, because it's kind of difficult to remove extra solder. However, you can do that. This particular circuit board is pretty messed up. Might be able to get something off of this. I'm going to try to remove this capacitor on this side of the circuit board because there's not that much solder there. So you want to clamp it in carefully, because if you try to remove things manually, using your hands, the copper pads will just come right out, and then your circuit board will be completely useless. So don't try that. What you need to do is desolder it. So what we have here is this desoldering braid. You can see it's a copper braid. There might be other metals in there, but you can tell that there's at least copper. And it's woven together so that it wicks up heated up solder. As you can see, this has been used before. so there's some solder traces there. Now, you're gonna want to be careful using this because it's a piece of metal touching your soldering iron, and all pieces of metal touching the soldering iron get nice and toasty. So be careful. And you're going to touch this to what you want to desolder, and you're going to touch the soldering iron to it, avoiding burning holes in your circuit board. You just want to heat up the solder. So okay, you can see now that I've removed some of the solder, but there's still plenty more, so let's keep going. Okay, so now you can see that most of the solder has been removed from that leg. Wouldn't go touching it just yet. It's still going to be very hot. You can see on the braid that there is a lot of solder that's been sucked up. So then we'll move on to the other side and get that solder. The thing with soldering is you have to be very patient because things have to melt after all. And sometimes things don't want to melt. And if you're not getting solder on one side, you can always try the other side. Might be more useful. Other side of the solder, that is. Get better surface area contact. Like, there you go. So now most of the solder has been removed. We're going to wait for the terminals to cool down, and then we're going to try and take that out. I need to just lightly touch the terminals, heat them up a bit, get them off of any remaining solder there. Useful to have pliers in this sort of situation. You can just move things around without having to touch it. This wouldn't be too much of an issue. Okay. And then the same for the other side. Just wick up some more of that solder. Wait for the terminal to cool down again. And then there we go. So now we have this capacitor removed from this horrible circuit board. We're going to put the soldering iron back in its stand. We're going to switch over to the less disgusting circuit board. So, as you can see here, there's a slot marked for capacitor, so that's where I'm going to put the capacitor in. Right in this slot. Try to get it in as close to the board as you can, just so that it doesn't get in the way of things in the future. And then, as I said, bend the legs out slightly so that it stays in place. And this leg that's in the way, I'm going to just clip that off. Okay, so you see that capacitor is now staying in place, and we don't have to touch it at all. and then we're going to solder it in. Now, what's important here is you want to touch the soldering iron to the copper pad and to the wire. So you want those two pieces of metal to be hot. And then you're just going to gently introduce the solder to the terminal. So here we go. So you want the solder basically on the other side of the wire from the soldering iron, so that you're not just burning off solder. You can make solder last quite a while, but not if you're just casually burning it. Okay, and you can see it's not quite covering the hole there, so we're going to need a bit more solder, but you do want to make sure when it looks like it's soldered, you take the solder away as quickly as you can so you don't waste it or make big large lumps like these. So we're going to go back in, heat things up again, and just bring in a bit more solder. And if you're having a hard time getting things to heat up, you can also get some flux. That's what makes solder melt so easily. That it comes separately from the solder also. And if you're using flux, you're going to need to like just sort of spread that on there. Okay. Alright. So now the solder is covering the pad completely, and the terminal is firmly secured with a nice small cone shape. And that's exactly what we're looking for. So now I'm going to switch over to the other side and solder that in. You want to make sure you don't accidentally burn a hole in this circuit board also. Okay, just like that. So yeah, now we've soldered both terminals in. Let them sit for a bit. Turn the soldering iron to its stand. It should cool down pretty quickly because things don't like being that hot. You know, thermodynamics and whatnot. So once we're satisfied that it's probably cooled off enough, we'll just clip the ends off of that component, and then there you go. So yeah, now we've successfully soldered a capacitor onto this circuit board, and that's pretty much how you solder anything onto this sort of circuit board. So have fun and don't touch anything that's hot. So now I've shown you how to solder. The important things to keep in mind are that the soldering iron, when plugged in, should always be treated as hot, even if it hasn't actually finished warming up yet, because it can give you very serious burns. The other thing to remember is that you don't want to put too much solder on there. Always make sure that you use just enough solder. So when you're going in with the solder itself, you want to bring it back out once you think that there's enough there. And if there's not actually enough there, like if it's not fully covering the pad, then just heat things up again and then put a bit more on there. Never just keep going, because you end up with just terrible lumps that can cause short circuits and, you know, circuit failures. Also, never try removing the solder with wire cutters or pliers or your hands. if you're going to remove solder, you need some of this soldering wick or another desoldering device. And then also make sure that once your component is in there and it's soldered properly, clip off the ends so that you have more room to work, and so the heat's not getting dissipated across multiple components, because that can cause problems for your soldering. And then finally, once you're done soldering, or once your teacher has told you, if you're in the class, to unplug the soldering irons for the day, make sure you unplug the soldering iron. And then the soldering iron is going to need to sit there for a while to cool off. You know, thermodynamics and whatnot.